It was a quiet afternoon on a typical city street. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows as people walked by. On the sidewalk, a man moved slowly, using a cane to support himself. His steps were steady but careful, each one deliberate. He wore a simple jacket, his face calm but showing signs of the struggle he faced daily. His disability was clear, but there was something dignified about the way he carried himself despite it all. A police officer patrolled the street, his eyes scanning the crowd. When he spotted the man with the cane, something shifted. With a smirk, he began to approach, his eyes narrowing as he watched the disabled man's every step. The officer called out, loud enough for others to hear. "Looks like someone needs a little extra help today," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The man continued walking, his eyes forward, refusing to engage. But the officer wasn't finished. He laughed, the sound mocking and harsh. The people around them slowed down, sensing the tension in the air. The disabled man felt the weight of the officer's words, but he kept walking, head held high. The officer stepped closer, his smirk widening. He was enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "Is it hard to get around with that thing?" he sneered, nodding toward the man's cane. The disabled man didn't react. His eyes were still forward, his focus on each careful step. But the officer wasn't letting up. "You should be more careful," the officer continued, his voice mocking. "Wouldn't want to fall and hurt yourself, right?" He let out a short, sharp laugh, as if he had just made the funniest joke. A few people who had been walking nearby glanced at the scene, some uncomfortable, others unsure what to do. The disabled man's grip tightened slightly on his cane, but he didn't respond. He didn't want to give the officer the satisfaction. But the officer wasn't finished yet. He took another step forward, leaning in, his voice louder now. "Maybe you need a hand," he said, pretending to offer help, but there was no kindness in his tone. His words were nothing more than an attempt to embarrass the man. The disabled man's face tightened for a moment, but he stayed composed. His breath was steady, though the officer's ridicule stung. He could feel the eyes of the people around him, their discomfort palpable. But he refused to give in. He continued walking, each step more deliberate than the last, determined not to let the officer break his spirit. The officer, growing bored, chuckled again and stepped back, feeling in control. "Guess you'll make it eventually," he said, louder than before, his words meant to sting. The crowd around them started to disperse, but the officer lingered for a moment, still waiting for a reaction, still enjoying the power he felt in mocking the man. But the disabled man said nothing. He kept walking, his steps steady, his dignity unshaken by the officer's cruel words. The disabled man's silence spoke volumes. He didn't engage with the officer, didn't offer him the satisfaction of a response. His steps, though slower than most, were firm. He focused on the rhythm of his walking, the soft tapping of his cane on the pavement, blocking out the officer's cruel words. Inside, his heart raced. The officer's comments stung, but he wasn't about to let that show. It wasn't the first time he had encountered cruelty because of his disability, and he knew it wouldn't be the last, but it still hurt. Every time. He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his grip on the cane, but his face remained calm. His posture, though tired, was proud. Every step he took was a victory, a reminder that he could still go forward, despite everything. As the officer's mocking laughter echoed in the distance, the man's mind remained focused on one thing: reaching his destination. He didn't want to give the officer any more of his time, any more of his energy. That man had no right to take away his peace. Despite the humiliation, despite the sting of the officer's words, the disabled man moved forward, with quiet strength. He didn't need to fight back with words. His silence, his refusal to break, said everything the officer needed to hear. And with every step, his resolve grew. The officer's mockery couldn't take away his dignity. It was his to keep, and no one, not even the officer, could strip him of it. As the officer stood there, still grinning and waiting for a reaction, something unexpected happened. From a distance, a black and white patrol car pulled up to the curb, its engine purring as it came to a stop. The officer, still standing with his smug expression, didn't notice the arrival at first. He was too caught up in his own moment of superiority. Then the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. The officer turned his head, surprised to see his superior walking toward him, a calm yet purposeful stride in his movements. The superior officer, a man in his mid-40s, had a reputation for being fair but firm. His presence was commanding without being loud. The officer's grin faltered when he saw the superior's expression. It wasn't anger, but something colder, disappointment, maybe even concern. The superior took in the scene in front of him, his eyes quickly scanning the man with the cane and then focusing on the officer. The silence between them felt heavy. The disabled man, still walking with his cane, was nearing the end of the sidewalk. He had been unaware of the new arrival, his focus entirely on getting away from the officer. But when he noticed the superior officer, he slowed just slightly, his eyes flicking between the two. The superior continued walking toward the officer, who finally straightened up and turned to face him. There was a brief moment of hesitation before the officer realized that the situation wasn't going unnoticed. His smirk had disappeared completely, replaced by an uneasy look. The superior stopped a few feet away from the officer, his eyes sharp and calm, like someone assessing a situation carefully. The officer's unease grew as the superior met his gaze, standing silently for a moment. The superior officer's voice broke the silence, firm but measured. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes locked on the officer, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. The officer's chest tightened, and for the first time he felt a surge of nervousness. The superior's gaze moved from the officer to the disabled man, who had now stopped walking, his back still straight, but his expression more tense. It was clear that he had noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The superior officer took a step closer to the officer, his tone never wavering. "You think mocking someone like him is funny?" the superior asked quietly, but the words hit the officer like a punch. The officer's face reddened, his lips pressing together as he tried to come up with a response. He hadn't expected to be challenged, especially not in front of someone else. The superior officer wasn't raising his voice, but the weight of his words was enough to make the officer uneasy. The officer tried to shrug it off. "He didn't seem to mind," he muttered, his voice defensive but lacking confidence. He forced a chuckle, trying to brush off the situation. "Just having a little fun, that's all." But the superior wasn't buying it. "No, you weren't," the superior replied, his voice still calm but now edged with disappointment. "You were mocking him, making him feel small, weren't you?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the superior held up a hand, silencing him. "You've crossed a line." The officer's mind raced. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he could feel the weight of the superior's gaze. The man had seen it all. He knew exactly what had happened. "You're supposed to serve and protect," the superior continued. "That means treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. This," he gestured toward the disabled man, "is not how we act. This is not the example we set." The officer stood there, speechless. He could feel his face burning, his pride stinging from the public reprimand. He had no comeback, no excuse. The superior was right. The superior officer didn't wait for a response. He turned his gaze back to the disabled man who was still standing quietly nearby. "I apologize for his behavior," the superior said, his voice softening. "You didn't deserve that." The disabled man met his gaze and nodded once, his face softening just a little. There was no anger in his eyes, just a calm acceptance. The superior turned back to the officer, giving him one last sharp look, before shifting his focus back to the situation at hand. The superior officer stood for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the air. The officer, still in shock, said nothing. He couldn't find the words, his mind racing, trying to come to terms with what had just happened. His head hung low, embarrassed by his own actions. Meanwhile, the disabled man stood silently, his cane steady in his grip. He hadn't said a word during the confrontation, but there was something in the air now, something that felt different. The tension was lifting. The superior officer turned his full attention to the man, his voice calm and respectful. "I'm sorry for what you had to endure," the superior said. "No one should ever be treated like that, especially not by someone who's supposed to protect and serve." His words were sincere, and they carried a deep respect for the man's strength, in staying silent, in not reacting. The disabled man gave a small nod, his expression softening. He didn't speak, but his face relaxed, the tightness fading from his features. The apology, though simple, carried a heavy weight. It wasn't just the words that mattered, it was the sincerity, the understanding behind them. For the first time in a while, the man felt a small sense of relief. The officer's cruelty still lingered in his mind, but in this moment, there was something else. A quiet recognition of his dignity. The superior officer had done what the officer never would, and that mattered more than anything. The officer, standing a few feet away, watched the exchange with growing discomfort. He felt small, ashamed, unsure of how to act now. The silence that followed was thick and telling, both men standing there, waiting for what would come next. The superior officer took a deep breath, his gaze shifting from the disabled man to the officer standing before him. There was no anger in his eyes now, just a quiet, firm resolve. He turned back to the officer, his tone calm but authoritative. "You need to apologize," he said simply, "now." The officer hesitated, his body stiffening as he realized the weight of what he had done. The superior didn't give him any more time to think. "Go on, apologize to him and make it genuine." The officer stood there, rooted to the spot. He was trying to find the right words, but nothing came. The embarrassment, the shame, everything was closing in on him. The disabled man, though, just stood there, unmoving, his face stoic. He wasn't looking for an apology, not really. But he wasn't going to refuse it either. The officer finally took a step forward, his eyes downcast. His voice when he spoke was quiet, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have said what I did." The words were difficult for him to get out, but they came out nonetheless. He could feel the eyes of the superior on him, and there was no escaping the discomfort of the moment. The disabled man looked at him for a brief second, then nodded slightly. His expression remained calm, his dignity intact. The apology wasn't for him to accept or reject. It was a necessary step, something the officer had to do. The superior officer, watching the interaction, gave a small nod of approval. He didn't need to hear more. The apology, though awkward, had been made. He turned to the disabled man again, offering a sincere, respectful look. "Thank you for your patience," the superior said softly. "We'll make sure something like this doesn't happen again." The disabled man gave a final nod, his posture relaxing just a little. Without another word, the superior officer turned away, signaling the end of the confrontation. The officer stayed where he was, still processing what had just occurred. His head remained low, unsure of what to do next. The disabled man, with his cane in hand, began to walk away, his pace steady once more. The officer watched him go, feeling the sting of his own failure. He had learned something that day, but it was too late to take back the damage he had caused. The street, now quiet again, seemed to carry the weight of the moment as both men went their separate ways.